Okay, folks, let's go ahead and get started here. Before we hop back into House Bill 147, we're going to need to call the roll. Barb, if you wouldn't mind.
Representative Angelos,
Here.
Representative Burkhart,
Here.
Representative Byron, Representative Larson,
Here.
Representative Singh,
Here.
Representative Storer, Chairman Western,
Present.
Representative Winter,
Here.
and I'll excuse Chairman Newsom.
Excused. Thank you, Barb. Just wondering maybe if we can get the good Johnson County Commissioner to close that door if that's possible, or we already got someone on it. Perfect. Okay, so picking up where we left off, technically we had closed public comment, but I think it was Ms. Johnson. No? Oh, okay. Ms. King? You're good? Okay, all right. Representative Provenza, I guess you don't want to testify. Do you want to give us the last word quickly if possible?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you, but also I did give you a couple amendments that I had spoken with some members of the committee earlier about that they had thought might be good amendments for this bill. The first one that you'll see deals with a question of taking out whether you want to take out the federal land, given that some of the testimony about the Bureau of Land Management might have something for this. I mean, that's up to the committee if they want to decide that. I think what in conversations with Game and Fish, that might make things a little bit more complicated because folks won't know who to call or when they need to step in. And so I don't know that I would recommend bringing that amendment per se, just because of that convolution. But I did want to make sure that you had that language if you wanted it. And then the second amendment that you have is one that talks about, was another one that we had discussed whether we should remove that criminal portion, Mr. Chairman, of which is on page 2, line 12. I believe you've received an amendment that could kind of clarify that. Some of the issue with removing that criminal, and I think you could, or you could leave it in, but defining it to the game and fish trespass statute, the hunter trespass, and to that criminal one, because in that game and fish trespass statute, there, I don't believe is actually language about signage, because as you know, Mr. Chairman, that onus is on the hunter and not necessarily the landowner to have a private property sign. So brought those for the committee if they want them. I think probably going with the amendment that was brought to you to refer to the game and fish and that 6-3 statute is probably the way to go. This would ensure that landowners have clarity that they are not in any way prevented from preventing trespass. So that's it for me, Mr. Chairman, unless you have further questions you'd like me to answer.
Committee, any questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Representative. Well, we've heard some of the testimony on it. Committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Representative Larson. Seconded with a mouthful by Representative Burkhart. Discussion? Obviously, we've got the bill itself and multiple amendments to choose from.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess based on what Representative Provenza stated, I'm now confused whether we want to leave federal in or remove the word federal. Could we have the department come back up on that issue,
If you'd like to, sure.
please?
Mr. King? Or Ms. Bruce?
Chairman Western, Representative Burkhardt, I'm sorry, I was not paying attention.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, if I might repeat my question.
Representative Burkhardt, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Warden King, do we want to remove the word federal in reference to federal lands, or do we want to leave it in? I'm now confused. I thought at the last meeting of this committee, we decided that we should probably remove it. And now I think I've heard we should probably leave it in. I just need some explanation, please. And I'm looking on page 1, line 3, last word federal, and then on page 2, line 5. Access to or the use of state or federal land.
Sure. Representative Western, Chairman Western, sorry, Representative Burkhardt. So as I read this suggested amendment on page 2, line 5, if or federal was deleted, then this provision would simply apply to signs that are on state land. So OSLI administered lands. I think that, as I testified the other day, the state clearly has the ability to enforce posting on state land. It would, so that amendment would entirely remove the federal land portion. I think it significantly changes the bill and the scope of it. Part of the concern that I expressed the other day was that on federal lands, the signing on federal lands is already something that's addressed by the federal agencies. So this would just put it clearly back into, as I read that, the scope of state lands only and within the state's scope of action.
No follow-up?
No follow-up, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. King. Committee? Any
I
further
have
discussion?
a different amendment, or are we on an amendment?
We are not on amendment. We're discussing the bill. Obviously, it's short enough. Potential amendments, concerns. Representative Storer?
I do have an amendment. This would go on page 2, line 12, after the word trespass. Insert as defined by WS 23-3-305B and WS 6-3-303. And I can provide you with that language, Barb.
Let's see.
And then deletes the remainder of line 12 and 13. The goal of this is just to ensure that landowners have clarity that they're not in any way prevented from preventing trespass on their own private property, and that their rights are protected with both criminal and game and fish trespass. So it doesn't require game and fish to enforce criminal trespass. However, it does clarify and solidifies the rights of owners.
It's been seconded. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Burkhardt?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If we leave criminal in there, criminal is in a different section, and actually I think by having criminal in there, when this talks about game and fish, and we're in 23-3-405, we may actually be violating the single subject issue, because criminal trespass comes in our criminal statutes, and the fine for trespassing to hunt or fish is considerably higher than criminal trespass, if I remember correctly. And that's not based on experience.
We'll take your word for it, Representative
Okay,
Burkhardt.
thank you.
Committee, any further discussion? I certainly think that, I mean, what we're going for here is to ensure that we're not interfering with landowners' inherent right to prevent trespass. I think there's obviously Title VI is the criminal trespass, and Title 23 deals with hunter trespass. I don't necessarily think it's we're dealing with two separate subjects. Both can happen. There's been a lot of confusion, discussion with wardens and et cetera about, well, do we enforce this as Title VI or do we enforce this as Title 23? Representative Burkhart?
Mr. Chairman, the only thing is, I do not think that our game and fish wardens are authorized to enforce Title VI. They only enforce Title III. They're not authorized to enforce criminal trespass, if I'm correct.
I see Warden King nodding his head, so we'll assume yes. Any further discussion? Or Representative Storr?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we could go ahead and make the amendment include the deletion of the word criminal in this case.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, could I have those statute references repeated, please?
Representative Storr, if you wouldn't mind, is
23-3, 305B, and 63303.
any further discussion?
M-
Representative
Mr.
Burkhart?
Chairman, I would propose an amendment to the amendment to remove 6-3-303, as that's the criminal statute.
Right?
Representative Storr, would you consider that a friendly amendment?
I believe so.
Okay. We'll strike 63303. Any further discussion on the amendment?
It's a little-
Representative Winter?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The way I understood that, the first amendment proposal was that we remove some of this verbiage, and I wonder if that's necessary. I think it'd be better to have it in there along with the statute, if I understood it correctly.
Further discussion? Sensing the urge to vote, all those in favor of the amendment say aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
That amendment is not adopted. We're back on the bill. Further discussion or amendments? Obviously, we've got a couple of them here for consideration. Representative Angelos, I think do you want to work your amendment now, or what are your thoughts? Go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as discussed in on Tuesday, I have to think what day this is, we talked about on eastern side of Wyoming, in a lot of Wyoming, we already have fences there that have been there for 100 years. So we want to make sure we protect our landowners. So we just put in, I had a amendment put in saying that it's section 2. It will say this act shall not apply to fences placed by a landowner before the effective date of this act. So just protecting our landowners, so they're not having to resurvey and refence.
Moved by Representative Angelos, seconded by Representative Larson. Any discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Representative
if I
Burkhart?
might, and I would suggest a friendly amendment to then include that portion, section 2, become effective immediately. Because you could get landowners going out, putting up fences right now in anticipation of when this becomes effective. So make just section 2, as it is in the amendment, effective immediately, make the rest effective July 1.
Representative Angelos, do you consider that a friendly amendment?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Any further discussion on the amendment? Since the urge to vote, all those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. That amendment is adopted. All right, we're back on the bill. Any further discussion or amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Burkhart?
did we consider proposed amendment 147H 44502 from Representative Provenza?
Representative Burkhart, that was touched on in Representative Storr's
Okay.
discussion, but not this specific one now.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman, I would move that amendment.
The amendment has been moved. Is there a second? Seconded by Representative Larson. Any discussion? Seeing none. Question being called. All those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
That amendment is adopted. We are back on the bill. Sensing there are no further questions. Reaching for a chip, not your mic, sorry. Classic. Sensing yours to vote, or would you please call the roll?
Representative Angelos,
Aye.
Representative Burkhart,
Aye.
Representative Byron,
Aye.
Representative Larson,
Aye.
Representative Singh,
Aye.
Representative Storer,
Aye.
Chairman Western. Representative Winter.
Aye.
Chairwoman Newsom is marked excused. 8 aye, 1 excused.
That bill passes committee number 6. That bill passes committee number 6. The next bill, I think I've got it in here. Next bill for our consideration is House Bill 123, collection of antler horns by residents and non-residents. Representative, give us your best shot.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I bring this bill, House Bill 124, or 123, excuse me, delays hunting for non-residents for 3 days. This bill is in response to an ever-increasing amount of non-resident horn and antler hunters in our state. So, Mr. Chairman, this bill will simply give resident sportsmen a 3-day head start on the collection of sheds and during the collection of shed season, right? So, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, this, again, I bring you House Bill 123 for your consideration. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to walk through the bill.
Please do.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we got page 1. If we look down here at section 1, we're going to line 14. So, Mr. Chairman, we go into state statute 23-1-1 or 103, ownership of wildlife, purpose of provisions. And then on page 2, for the purpose of this act, all wildlife in Wyoming is property of the state, including sheds, shed antlers, and horns located on public lands. And remember, private landowners will continue to own these horns on their private land. We're not taking that away from them, all right, or anything. The reason, Mr. Chairman, this is important is to establish that our Wyoming Game and Fish Department has authority for horns and sheds on public lands. Okay, so Mr. Chairman, if we look at page 2, line 11 there now, the 23-1-302 powers and duties. The commission is directed and empowered. So let's look down now at line 15, Mr. Chairman, to regulate and control the collection of shed antlers and horns of big game animals for the purpose. Okay, and we kind of go through that, but on line 22, 23-3-117, pursuant to this paragraph, the commission may establish by rule seasons for the collection of big game, animal shed antlers, and horns on public lands. Any season to collect big game animal antlers and horns shall begin for residents 3 days before the start of the season for non-residents. Okay? So this, Mr. Chairman, this again does not apply on private lands. It'll only apply on our public lands. Okay? So again, Mr. Chairman, if we look at section 2, now we're gonna talk about what the commission shall promulgate all the rules necessary to implement the provisions of this act. And then section 3 here, we look at provided the date, then effective date, July 1, 2023. And then we want sections 2 and 3 of this act effective immediately. Okay, so I stand for any questions, comments.
Thank you,
concerns,
Representative
Madam Chair.
Berger.
Thank you.
Committee, any questions? Representative Burkhart.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mhm.
So Representative Berger, this section talks about a specific area. And we're talking pretty much west of Interstate 90, west of Interstate 25. There are considerable elk and deer herds, specifically elk, east of Interstate 25. And I would think particularly if I was going to go hunt horns, I'd hunt them in the Fortification Creek area in northern Converse County, southern Campbell County. Hey,
That's all right. I'm
I'm
Thank
just,
you.
okay.
Burkhart.
So, this will not apply to those areas. So you'll still have non-residents coming into the Black Hills and those areas east of Interstate 25 and 90 to hunt shed antlers. Am I correct? Is that your intent? That it only is west and not the whole state?
Representative Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Burkhart. I'm unclear on that one. I think it's for the entire state. Is that area private lands? I guess that's my question, Representative Burkhart.
Representative Burkhart.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So for clarification, most of those areas in there are mixed. And that particular area I mentioned is wintering range and it is mixed ownership. There is some private, there's some public, there's some state. It's a mishmash of ownership in there. But this section of the statute refers only west of 90 and west of 25. So I just want to know if that's your intention to cover those areas or to cover the whole state, because this section of statute covers only the west. And I remember the debate on this issue, and that was the dividing line a number of years ago. I don't know if the good chairman was here for that debate. I don't remember, but that was a long, hard debate. That's why I'm asking the question.
Representative Berger.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, that's a great question. And, I wasn't here. And so I guess for that statute, if that means that, then I guess we would just say for those areas, as far as I want is the public lands, so I guess we'd have to try to make this clarification better. So I don't know. Mr. Speaker, do you? Okay. So for right now,
don't have a
I don't
lifeline.
have a
Excuse me,
clue
yes.
on that, Mr. Representative Burkhart.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I might
Representative
follow up.
Burkhart.
So Representative, I guess we need to know if the intention is to cover the entire state or only the areas mentioned in Romanet 31. And that is an important issue. Most of the land east of those two interstates is private, but there is public land in there. And this has historically been a bone of contention with the legislature on where that dividing line is. And this was a compromise reached years ago. So if it's your intent to only cover west, then you're fine. If it's your intention to cover east also, or the whole state, then I don't think your bill does that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr.
Representative Berger.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Burkhart, my intent on this was to cover the entire state. So that's my intent. Mr.
Follow
Burkhart.
up.
Thank you.
Well, my only follow-up would be that this doesn't do it,
Okay.
if that's your intention. And Representative, I don't want to kill your bill, so I think it's a decision you need to make whether to pull it and run a bill later or to go with what you have now.
Representative Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Then if the intention is for to go to the west side, I'll keep it for that.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burkhardt.
Any further questions? Representative Berger? Seeing none? Oh, Representative Storr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Berger, I'm just curious, we have a lot of shed hunters in the northwest part of the state, and a lot of them do come from out of state. I'm just curious, and maybe this is a question for others, but just thinking about how to enforce this, whether you've had discussions about how this could be enforced. Thank you.
Representative Berger?
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Storr. So where I would refer to is go back to, let's see, where am I at? Section 2 on page 3, there, line 6, where we're just giving it back to the Game and Fish Commission, and that they can promulgate all the rules necessary to implement the provisions. So they have rules and they have stuff in their body, and they can come up with what their rules are going to be as far as determining in-state non-residents and how they're going to enforce it. That's what we've asked them in this bill.
Follow up? Representative Angelos? Nope, okay. Representative Berger, thank you very much. We may bring you back up here, so stick around, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you guys.
Okay, let's go ahead to agencies. I would imagine Game and Fish would have something to say about this or have some comments. Mr. King, obviously, we know who you are, but if you would just mind state your name and who you're with, please.
Chairman Western, members of the committee, good afternoon. My name's Rick King. I'm Chief Game Warden with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you about this bill. I think a little bit of background might be helpful. So early in the early 2000s, we heard from the public their concern about disturbance on winter ranges from folks hunting for shed antlers and horns, and that as that activity became more and more popular, the concern over that disturbance on wintering grounds increased, and we heard it pretty loud and clear, and so we actually reviewed the opportunity for the commission to regulate that just in regulations through rule and regulation. And at the time, the Attorney General told us in an opinion that the commission didn't have the authority to regulate shed antlers and horns. And so in 2009, the legislature actually created this ability, gave the authority to the commission to promulgate rules to govern the collection of shed antlers and horns. So it's been in place for a long time. Initially, it was just set up west of the Continental Divide. It was modified in 2019 to expand that area that the commission could regulate the collection of shed antlers and horns. And at that time, we promulgated a new rule. This is all done under Chapter 61 of Commission Regulations. And we expanded the area in which we have the closure. And that's the map that I passed out to you. So that's the current map for the area where the commission has a closure on the collection of shed antlers and horns from January 1 through 6 a.m. on May 1. So that's a little bit of the history. Relevant to this bill, I see two major changes for the commission to address with this bill. One will be that we we currently do not differentiate. We don't have a differential season for residents versus non-residents. So the commission will need to address that. And I think the other point I'd bring up is that the commission in 2019, when they promulgated a rule in 2020 in Chapter 61, they set a noon opener. And some of you may remember that. My ears are still ringing from that experiment. It didn't go so well, only because we had a lot of folks who saw people out on the landscape from sunrise to noon. We got a ton of calls. It was really hard for us to chase that down and find who was really violating the regulation and who wasn't. So the very next year, the commission promulgated a new Chapter 61 and set 6 a.m. as that closure period. So January 1 to May 1, 6 a.m. Seems to have worked a lot better. I think that the 3-day differential for residents versus non-residents could result in a similar situation where for about 3 days there, I think we're going to have a lot of calls to try to track down, which is fine. The other portion of this bill that I think could help the commission with some clarification is that just prior to Section 2, in this particular bill, resident and non-residents is going to be tough for us as is, because there's no license required for collecting shed antlers and horns. And I wouldn't want to steer the discussion in that regard, but we'll need some ability to differentiate between residents and non-residents. And so I think some clarity there, that some language inserted that clearly says the commission shall establish some sort of mechanism to determine who's resident and non-resident for the purposes of this section would be very helpful for us. And with that, I'll stop there and stand for any questions.
Committee, any questions? Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Warden King, so you said some mechanism. Are you thinking like, we currently have a conservation stamp or, a lifetime hunting, fishing license, those sorts of things? Are you thinking something along those lines of I'm just picking something here, a $5 permit or something? If you could clarify, please.
Sure. Chairman Western, Representative Burkhart, I was thinking something even more simple than that. If some language was inserted there that went something along the lines of the commission shall establish the requirements and proof for residency for this purpose, then some kind of a simple online authorization perhaps could work. Something that a person could sign a sworn statement that they truly are a resident, however the commission defines resident versus non-resident for this purpose.
Thank you.
Committee, any further questions? Mr. King, Representative Winter, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief King, are you saying that a resident would also need to get a identification or a authorization to be out there to hunt antlers?
Chairman Western, Representative Western, yes, something that our field personnel will have the ability to determine who's resident and who's non-resident. Any kind of any proof that our field folks could quickly ascertain residency would be very helpful.
Representative Winter, follow-up? Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Warden King, could that be as simple as a current or previous resident hunting license?
Mr. King, excuse me.
Chairman Western, Representative Burkhart, I think that could be a great simple solution. I'm a simple-minded guy. I like simple, and that sounds, without giving it too much thought, that sounds like that could be a simple fix.
I'm good.
Committee, any further questions? Mr. King, the one thing, I guess, I certainly appreciate, wardens need to be able to determine, very quickly if, who they are. I guess I'm struggling to see why I wouldn't just say, let me see your ID. If you have a Wyoming ID, you're a resident. If you don't, then you're a non-resident. I mean, do you think, could it be that simple, or do you think there might be a little more to it than that? Mr. King?
Chairman Western, I think it may be something more than that. You know, for example, the requirements to get a resident driver's license are different than what's required for a resident hunting or fishing license, and the requirements for voter ID are different. And if there's nothing that's spelled out in here in terms of what a resident or non-resident is, I think somebody could make a pretty strong argument that they can claim they're a resident without any kind of proof. I just think that if you look at the specifications in Title 23 for residency versus non-residency, it's very clearly articulated what is required to meet residency requirements. And if that's not defined in this, I worry that people will find a loophole to claim residency.
And so, Mr. King, that would be 365 continuous days of living in Wyoming, if I recall correctly.
Chairman Western, for hunting and fishing licenses,
Right.
yes, absolutely.
Well, committee, if there's no further questions, we appreciate your testimony, Mr. King. Oh, Representative Storer, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Warden King, I'm just, I have not been out to see what happens in my hometown on May 1st, but I understand people are lined up. They spend the night on the fairgrounds in many cases, then they line up to gain access, not to the elk refuge, but to the Forest Service lands beyond the elk refuge. And it is a bit of a circus, would be probably a understatement. And I'm just trying to think about how this bill could impact the ability to actually even manage the folks that show up.
Chairman Western, Representative Storer, I think you're hitting on some of the challenges that we experienced with the noon opener. There's nothing that prohibits a person in most places from being out on the landscape. And what we saw when we set that noon opener is that a lot of people were out just wandering around, doing nothing illegal, but everybody reported them as being antler hunters or not. It was just really a challenge for us to determine who was in violation of this regulation and who wasn't. And so I think that that same scenario potentially will play out here. Non-residents could be out on the landscape, wandering around. There's nothing that's going to prohibit that, especially on public lands. So it'll just be a challenge for us to meet the public's expectation that we keep the non-residents from picking up antlers while they have the 3-day differential. Not impossible, but certainly difficult.
Follow up? Mr. King? Oh. Okay. Well, Mr. King, thank you for your testimony. Appreciate it. And again, stick around if you wouldn't mind.
Thanks.
Any other state agencies? All right, let's move on to public testimony. Ms. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Jess Johnson with the Wyoming Wildlife Federation. I'm their Government Affairs Director, and I would love to say that I actually remember what the representative was talking about when the first sort of discussion of regulation of shed antler hunting and the authority to the commission came about. It was controversial and filled all of our inboxes, I think. But it was just east of I-25, and I think there was something with I-90 in there as well on where that was. So that was a good point that I hadn't thought about with this bill, and is something maybe to reflect on in that case. But we're love the idea that we're worried about what's happening with this shed antler thing. This is a problem. There's, it's an incentive, it's a moneymaker. People are making $60,000 a year on the collection of shed antler hunting. I'm a person who has collected shed antlers just when I've been hunting, happened to sell them and made $700 after a hunting season. It's money, it makes money. And so there is an impetus to be out there. There's a lot of desire and a lot of people to get out there first and to be first. So I really appreciate what this bill is trying to get at, but I do have the same concerns that the agency had shared around this, the inability to tell the difference between a resident and a non-resident, and to look at how we even can enforce that. You know, is it somebody out walking their dog? Is it somebody out horseback riding, or are they in the act of shed hunting at that point? How do you tell the difference? Do we go up and ask everybody for driver's license? I can tell you, I certainly don't carry that when I'm on my horse. So there's, I think, a lot of nuance to be sort of sussed out here. And I think I really appreciate the conversation that this bill has brought forward. But in action itself, I'm concerned about how this bill would affect the actual effectiveness of enforcing this. So I think we are against the bill, but for the conversation and for the continued look at how we deal with this.
Committee, any questions, Ms. Johnson? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Appreciate it. Any other public testimony? Let's see, I think, do we have?
Mr. Chairman, you have one online who has their hand up.
Okay, let's go ahead and admit them, please. Josh, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead.
Chairman Western, members of the committee. Josh Metton with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. I'm out of Cody, Wyoming. Appreciate the opportunity to comment on this bill. As Ms. Johnson alluded to, shed hunting is an important thing to a lot of sportsmen and outdoor enthusiasts. It also has impacts on wildlife. And one thing I wanted to bring up is that we have recent studies. Bates et al. 2021 shows that mule deer show increased distance moving by 97%, an average of 742 meters in the presence of shed hunting pressure. Same mature deer will increase their distance traveled by over two times, with an average of 1,264 meters outside of their home range. So when we're thinking about our wildlife populations, I think regulating shed hunting has the potential to also help our wildlife. So we at TRCP, we support conserving migration corridors and winter range. We support committing to science-based management and the North American model of conservation. These are priorities we've developed and shared with legislators. A shed hunting season could help with these by improving game and fish's management of this. We would, as far as this bill goes, I think we would echo concerns that have been previously brought up. We see this as a great conversation regarding shed hunting and regarding finding ways to improve how we manage it in the state to the benefit of both sportsmen and wildlife. One suggestion with the challenges of regulating this is a test case that you could look at doing would be focusing this bill on state managed lands such as habitat management areas. The Du Bois area, for instance, has a application to access those lands for shed hunters in a lottery. So that could be one way to kind of test this out with the difference in terms of residents versus non-residents. And I think another part of discussion that would be good to consider is the idea of a shed hunting license, and collecting fees for shed hunting for residents and non-residents. So with that, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mitten. Any questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony. Appreciate it. All right, any speaker summaries?
So, Mr. Chairman, committee members, I stand on in support of this bill. If you think about what's gone on since we started, and I was there at the beginning when we really started this shed season. And in fact, I can remember on the winter range around my country where people were basically on snowshoes with dogs running deer at this time they were in the worst shape. So we created this. But with it, we created some issues. And one of those issues is when we turn that on the 1st of May, there's a huge influx of people onto the landscape. And I think what this will do is it will ease that in other words, it'll ease that rush of people in and maybe dampen it a bit, which I think is going to be good for wildlife and certainly good for resident horn hunters who complain to me every year about the number and the continuing, I guess, increase of numbers of resident or non-resident horn hunters. I think one thing this bill does that's also really important is it on public lands, it actually gives ownership of shed antlers to the Game and Fish to then give away to the public. And why that's important is frankly, the law that exists, I think, is on shaky ground to begin with because they don't own it. And so there's some good reasons for this bill. And as it relates to residency, I think a driver's license is fine, frankly, but I don't think you have to put that in. I think all you have to put in there is by rule and regulation, you shall promulgate rule and regulation to define residency in this case. And rule and regulation is a public process. Sportsmen of this state and other states will be able to comment on that. And I suspect that comment will be robust. But I do believe if you just give them the explicit authority and frankly charge to decide where residency in this case, it'll be adequate. Are they going to have trouble year one? Yeah, maybe even year two. But I think in the long run, they'll be able to handle this task. And they already get plenty of complaints about out-of-state people coming in on that first day. I mean, hordes of them in my country, not one or two. I'm talking lots and lots of people. And so I think it'll give them over time the ability to regulate this without over-regulating our resident horn hunters. That was, I think, the intent of this is not to over-regulate, not to create a permit. But let's just back off the resident. And we're not stopping non-residents from hunting horns. We're just delaying it. But I think that'll help in the long run. So with that, I would stand for any questions. And on the issue, you don't want to open up the issue of the border between, you don't want to go down that path. That was a tough one. So I think you want to leave that one alone. So I'd stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Committee. Representative Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Speaker, my question is, how will this affect the folks that are coming to the state of Wyoming and spending time in the state and spending their money in order to accommodate their trip to come horn hunting? It sounds like they really enjoy it. So I just want to know how that will affect the numbers.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman, good question. It will dampen the number of people that come in. The question you have to ask, how much do they spend in the community? Some, certainly, there's some, but most of them stay in campers. They're not staying in at least what I see around my area. They're not staying in the hotels. They're staying in campers, tents, all those sorts of, these are people that, with backpacks. I mean, that's what they do. Horse gear. Certainly they drop money in our communities, and I'm not going to deny that at all.
Follow up?
No, that answers my question.
Committee. Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I just want to make sure I understand the map and the earlier conversations about regulating shed hunting. So it's your advice that we would only have this bill apply in the area outlined on this map rather than west of I-25 and 90. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storr, what the current authority is west of I-90, I-25, however that split is. The red line is their current, the area they currently have a horn hunting season in. What this bill would say is for those areas that you have a horn hunting season in, you delay that. There's been discussion in other areas to have a horn hunting season, but they've never done it. There was a discussion around a little bit around the Bighorns. There was a discussion up around Cody. I can't remember how far this map goes. And so far, those areas have chosen that they didn't want that. So it would still be authority west of, but it would only be in areas that they define as a horn hunting area, which is the red line right now, until they change that at some point, if they do. Mr. Chairman.
Follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in those other areas that are west of the interstates, there is no season, correct? So people can go out at different times of the year to look for sheds.
Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Thank you.
Representative Burkhart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, you live on the land, so I think you could answer this. Could you give us an estimate of maybe split between resident and non-resident? Are they equal, or you have more non-residents coming in?
Mr. Speaker?
So, Mr. Chairman, that's a really good question, and Chief King might know better than me. I can tell you the closer you get to the border, right? So I know in Kimmer, I'm going to say, I think confidently that probably out-of-staters outnumber residents. You get in my area, maybe residents outnumber out-of-state residents when you get further away from the border. But, I think Chief King would maybe have a guess at that better than I.
And
Mr. Speaker, I see Mr. King shaking his head. But Representative Burkhart?
follow up, please. Okay. So, Mr. Speaker, do you think that in this bill, we need to define what shed hunting is when there's actually shed hunting, or do you think we should leave that to rule and reg of the commission?
Speaker?
Mr. Chairman, I think you should leave it as it is on that. Just leave it to the commission.
Okay.
Because they're going to get input from locals, whether locals want. Anytime we start drawing lines on a map, it's not a good thing. It's better left to local people to have that input.
Thank you.
Members, any further questions for the speaker? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, committee.
Any further public comment? Seeing none. Oh, Representative Berger, do you want to get the last word in? Go for it.
So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members for, and everybody else's testimony today. I really appreciate that. So Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure that this is for residents of Wyoming. Okay? We have hunting seasons that we give a lot of residents priority to rather than non-residents. And I think the residents want to see this. And I feel strongly about this bill. This is a good feel bill for our residents, and they're really going to like this. I appreciate all you're doing, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Berger. Appreciate it. Seeing no further testimony, public comment is closed. Committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Representative Larson,
Second.
second by Representative Byron. Discussion?
Chairman, I certainly would chime in.
Representative Byron.
Thank you, Chairman. There's some great questions that were asked of the good speaker, but I can tell you that in where the mountains are sharp, the shed antler hunting the day before certainly brings parts of Western Wyoming to a standstill because of the influx of people. So I think there was a great question about the economic impact, which I certainly note, but I actually think it might make it a bit easier to regulate. You know, you're going to have a big rush, as we've all seen, and over the next few days, it kind of peters out. I think you'll get a second wave potentially. You know, I think they will still come. I think this is a great idea, and I think it's worth certainly moving the bill today and bringing it out to the floor. And I, you know, I will say that I think there's a lot of ways to get through this residency versus non-residency, and I think it's important for the commission to be able to regulate that. But I think it might actually make things easier in parts of this zone we're discussing for the intent of this bill. So I stand in favor.
Committee, further discussion? Seeing none, question being called. Barb, will you please call the roll?
Representative Angelos.
Aye.
Representative Burkhart.
Aye.
Representative Byron.
Aye.
Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Singh.
Aye.
Representative Storer. Aye. Chairman Western. Representative Winter. Madam Chairman is excused.
Barb, if you wouldn't mind, would you announce the results, please? Excellent. Representative Berger, I assume you're going to be managing this on the floor? Yeah. Let's assume so. Let's see, where are we? Tracking my bills here. All right. The next bill for our consideration is House Bill 171, Notice of State Land Leases and Local Opportunities, presented by our very own committee member.
Thank you, Chairman and Board. In front of you is House Bill 171. It's at the end of your file. We skipped a few bills, so I'll give you guys a second to pull it up. The purpose of the bill is to give, it's twofold. It's to give 30 days notice prior to an RFP, which is a request for proposal or bid, if you will, on OSLI's website, in a newspaper of general circulation in the county or counties where the state land is to be leased, and to current lessees of the land, owners, lessees, or lawful occupants of adjoining land via certified mail. So that what the intent there is that when one of these RFPs goes out, it sometimes catches folks off guard. This is lease specific. This is not sale specific. It occasionally catches these described classes in here off guard. So this would just be a courtesy that this request will be opening so they can essentially get their ducks in a row and figure out if they are interested in applying for or putting in a bid for one of these proposals. The second part of this bill will allow for a mechanism which will allow a match to the highest bid within the RFP. So if someone were to come in and bid $1 on a piece of state land, it would essentially allow a time frame for that bid to be matched. And I actually have a few amendments, so I think it'd probably be best to walk through the bill, if that's the chairman's desire, and then I can kind of tell you where I've gotten since this bill was filed with some feedback from a number of different folks.
Representative Byron, please do walk us through the bill.
And you guys have the bill in front of you, and just in the respect of time, I think essentially, page 1, line 12, Wyoming State Statute 36.5.118 would be created to read leasing of school lands. Now, I will tell you part of the amendment that I'm going to ask for you guys to consider is take the word school out of this entire bill, and it would just read state lands, but we can get to that here in a little bit. Going to page 2, you can read, starting on line 4, it mentions that 30 days notice, how that is going to get circulated, where it's going to get posted, who's going to be notified. Going into page, still on page 2, line 13, it would allow those that are adjoining or others of the community that 5-day window to potentially match. The intent of the bill is to keep the decision in OSLI's hands. It's not to take that away, but just allow for people to match the bid. Obviously the goal here is to optimize the revenue generating for the kids. I think it's important to note, especially for some pushback I received on page 3, line 2, this does not apply to the renewal of existing grazing or agricultural leases. I got some pushback from folks that have had these leases for a long time and were concerned, and that language was actually brought to me by the good folks in agriculture. As you continue, you go into current statutes, page 3, line 9, 36.5.103, 14. Refers back to 36.5.118, which is what this bill creates. And then it continues on to, current statute that exists. And then there's obviously, because of the new statute, some conforming stuff as you get into pages 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I think it's important. OSLI is for some of you that may not know, Office of State Land Investment, Board of Land Commissioners can also be referred to as, and also an RFP, like I noted, was request for proposal, and that's often how these leases, or it's the mechanism the leases do get opened up for potential lessees to put their name in that. So I know that was quick. I'm happy to stand for questions. I'll give folks time to read through it because I was cruising there. Thank you.
Committee members, any questions? Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So representative question, and I'm on page 2, there at line 18. 5 business days after the director gives applicants notice of the highest bid to match the highest bid. Does this then go into call it a bidding war? It just says match the highest bid. But if they match it, does someone else then get to come in and kick that up? Does it become a bidding war like you would at an auction?
Thank you, Chairman.
Representative Byron.
Chairman, Representative Burkhart, great question. No, that is not the intent of the language. It's to match, specifically said match. And I will note that, once again, I have some amendments that if it's the desire of the committee that we move forward with this, that 5 actually gets turned into 15. And I can talk about that later, but no, it is not the intent for any sort of bidding war. It's just to allow folks to match. They're on the end of line 18, the highest bid.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. So, Representative, I guess that causes me some concern. So they have a high bid, someone comes in and matches it. Then who gets the lease?
Representative Byron.
If you read further along, Chairman and Representative Burkhart, read further along 36.5.105, and I have the green book that I stole, but I can certainly hand it back up to you guys because I've studied these statutes pretty carefully. Still allows for that OSLI board to decide. I want the decision to remain in the OSLI board's hand, as well as 36.5.107. And then you can read on line 21. If there is not, within those 2 statutes, a direction or the OSLI board hasn't decided, if applicable, and if not, to any applicant with the highest bid. So the intent is then the OSLI board will still get to decide on, for example, if, player A and player B both have bid $1, it's still going to go back to the OSLI's decision.
Oh.
No.
Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Byron, I would like to better understand page 5, the preference given for owners, lessees, or lawful occupants of adjoining lands. So in the case of, let's say they're 2 very different uses, but they've essentially put similar bids together, or what the RFP requires for a bid, then this preference would play into the decision of OSLI would direct their direction in one way or another. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman? Representative Storer, this is currently in state statute, so it's not my intent to change any of that. You can refer back to 36.5.118, and I think it's, once again, worth noting, on page 3, section B, nothing in this section shall apply to the renewal of existing grazing or agricultural leases. So, preference is a word that gets thrown around a lot in section 36.5 all over the place. So, it is my intent and the goal to certainly not change that and leave the statute as it is. And you're correct, there could be two very similar bids. But the goal would be that the current lessee would still have that control or preference. But still, once again, I think all of this is subject to the desires of OSLI.
Follow-up?
Yes, one other question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Byron. So I understand that. In part, I think that the good bringer of the bill, it appears to me to make sure that there is notice in a community when a lease is actually let, which has been an issue certainly in Teton County. So I just want to make sure, clarify that that's really the goal here that we're talking about. Thank you.
Chairman.
Representative Byron?
Thank you, Representative Storer, for that follow-up. Yeah, if you dig deep into the Green Book, there are a lot of sections and subsections within it that do certainly have that preference. So yeah, it allows it, especially in the case you're discussing and other cases I've heard about, the southern and eastern side of the states, to have that provision in there. And the notice aspect of your question, which is very important, is I consider it a vehicle to just make the communication clear for the process.
Follow-up? Representative Storer? Representative Burkhart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative, I guess I'm still a little confused. I've looked at what you said on page 2, line 19 on, and at the end of that, after the two quoted and included statutes, it says, if applicable, and if not, to any applicant with the highest bid pursuant to the requirements of this chapter. So again, I guess I'm concerned we don't get into a bidding war here. If they don't meet the requirements of 36.5, 105, and 107, that we don't go that route of now having some sort of weird bidding war that the Board of Land Commissioners has to resolve. If you could address that, please.
Representative Byron?
Chairman, thank you. Representative Burkhart, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to go back to match on line 18, and I'd be happy to work on an amendment as we get to line 21 after that specific statute decided. It is not the intent to have a bidding war. It is certainly the intent to have a matching opportunity. So yeah, I think that would open up something I'm not interested in thinking about right now. Nor do I think anyone behind me would like to think about that sits on that good board. So it is a mechanism, the intent, not to overuse that word, is a mechanism to allow anyone that has interest or shows interest in these lands statewide to be able to maximize the potential opportunity, which is in a lot of different statute, but also ultimately giving a little nod to hopefully adjacent landowners and regional people that might have interest to keep an eye on this good land of our state.
Any follow-up? Seeing none. Further questions, committee? Seeing none. Thank you, Representative Byron, obviously hanging around in case we have more questions. All right, let's go to state agencies. Dr. Scoggins, obviously, I know who you are, but if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, please.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Jennifer Scoggin. I'm the Director of the Office of State Lands and Investments. With me is Deputy Director Jason Crowder. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on this bill. And I think I would start by saying that I'm glad that we heard the introduction because I'm not sure that we understood that the proposed bill was only limited to our RFP process. The way that we read the bill is that it's applicable to all of our processes. And so I wanted to just start out with a little bit of background, and some of you may already know this, but the Act of Admission back in 1890, Section 4 gave lands in Section 16 and 36 in each township to the state of Wyoming to support common schools. And Section 10 allows the lands to be leased for various things such as minerals, grazing, and other purposes. Then Wyoming, with its constitution, accepted the terms of the Act of Admission. Article 18, Section 1, Wyoming accepted those lands for those purposes. Article 18, Section 3 then established the Board of Land Commissioners, which, as you know, are the top 5 elected officials, and they have the direction, control, leasing, and disposal of the lands granted for the support of public schools. They also are responsible for taking care of that trust asset or those lands. They have a fiduciary duty to those trust beneficiaries. And OSLI, we are the administrative arm for the Board of Land Commissioners and also the State Loan and Investment Board, which is not at issue here today. But we also, by statute, have a fiduciary duty to the trust beneficiaries. And so when I look at a draft bill, the first thing that I'm always concerned about is how will this bill further the interests of the trust beneficiaries? And I'm not sure, based on how this bill is written, that that's the case. The way I read the bill was that it essentially puts the counties in control of development on state lands and allows them to potentially usurp the role of the Board of Land Commissioners. Now, it sounds like maybe that's not the intention of the author of the bill, but the bill is a little confusing. Like Representative Burkhart, we were confused about the matching piece. If in fact a county resident is allowed to match a bid, it says the board then has to issue it to the highest bidder, but who's higher if it's in a matching situation? So that's one thing that's confusing to us. Additionally, I'm trying to think of I think it's page 3, line 2, says that this is not applicable to the renewal of existing grazing or agricultural leases. But then if you move into some of the statutory on page 6, where it says section C, that's out of our renewal leasing statutory piece. And so I'm not exactly sure also what it means by as applicable. That's throughout the bill. It references the new section, that 36.5.118, which is being created, and it's applied as applicable, and that it's not clear to me exactly what the intent is here. The concern too is our leasing process, mainly for special use leasing. It's a little more dynamic. We don't always have a competitive bid situation. Sometimes we're approached as part of a project where people are interested in a long-term lease for a revenue generation opportunity on state lands, and it takes some time to kind of flesh out what that looks like, what those terms might be, and then the rental, if you will, for that lease, it can be negotiated. Of course, market is the minimum, but it can be negotiated as part of the opportunity. There are also situations where there are revenue streams as part of that revenue generation opportunity that are also paid to the trust beneficiaries. So what's unclear to me is if you're in one of those situations where you've had long-term discussions with an applicant, there's a revenue generation opportunity, you notice it, and then somebody in the county is able to match that. Do they also have to match the revenue stream opportunity? So that's a little bit unclear. Another concern is there's no real opportunity for the board to conduct due diligence on the potential matcher, if you will, of the rental price. And let's see. In my concern is that the bill gives the county residents and businesses a preference to really direct those leasing opportunities on state lands. And these are not county lands. These are lands that are held in trust for the trust beneficiaries, and the board has that constitutional charge of taking care of those lands. With that, Mr. Chairman, I would stop and yield to Deputy Director Crowder, and he can kind of tell you some additional pieces about our leasing process. And he was also very much involved in the RFP process in Teton County, and he can maybe talk about things in light of that revelation to us today that this was for the RFP process.
Deputy Director Crowder, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I'll start on the grazing side, as the director mentioned. The bill states that this is not to relate to existing grazing and agricultural leases, which means we're focused on vacant lands. And the definition of vacant lands are simply those lands that are not subject to an active or valid agricultural grazing lease. In existing statute, and it's within the bill too, the legislature has given us clear guidance on how we are to lease those lands if they are considered vacant. As I read the bill, we are to go through the requirements, the notification requirements of the citizens of a county that the land is within for 30 days, give an expression of a desire to lease, and typically that expression comes on behalf of the office and not by another applicant of any kind, but there is an expression to lease. We'd make that advertisement. We'd have an ability for somebody to match. And again, there's not a party in this situation to match a bid against. And then we would determine if we were subject to existing agriculture and grazing statutes, and that's 36.5.105 as the bill states. We would go through that whole process and understand that we had to go through the vacant land leasing process as well. And as you can see in the draft bill, the requirements, and it begins on page 5, line 12, for us to lease vacant lands, has a notification period. It has who we are to notify and how we are to do it. So we will have gone through 2 notification periods as a result of this bill to ultimately lease a piece of vacant land. And so I just wanted to make sure that the committee was aware of that. And at the end of it, we are to also give a preference to those who are holding adjoining lands or other measures that the bill contemplates as far as providing a preference in leasing vacant land. And I believe the bill conflicts with the current preference that is in existing statute when we get to that part of the process. So I just wanted to highlight that for the committee. The second part is in commercial leasing. As the director mentioned, we do read this bill as applying to all leasing of state lands in a agricultural and commercial sense, obviously not in a mineral sense, and didn't appreciate the fact that it was related to an RFP process. And the director went through many of the ways that commercial leases are approved by the board and are let on the property and how they could operate. As she mentioned, some of them are very specific to the benefit of adjoining land or the uses of adjoining land. And many examples of that are ancillary oil and gas uses, tank batteries, pipelines, power lines that support an oil and gas field. Or they could be a water well that supports an adjacent residential development or housing. But that situation, it seems a little problematic and probably a little inappropriate to have every citizen of the county come in and bid on that particular use. It creates a problem there. So I wanted to highlight that problem for the committee. And if we don't read this to be applicable to an RFP situation, then it directly conflicts with an RFP process that we might initiate. The Board of Land Commissioners, as well as the legislature, has told us that we need to get market rates for all of the uses of state land. And sometimes we recognize to do that, we have to submit a solicitation or an RFP of some kind out to the public and see what kind of bids we can get back, and not just do an appraisal of that property. In fact, the Board of Land Commissioners has created the wind development rules, and inside of there, it specifically directs us, if we know there are more than one interested party in a particular part of the world, we are to solicit an RFP for wind generation on those parcels. If we do that RFP and get a result back, and obviously that would result in an expression of interest for lease, then we have to go back out to all of the citizens of the county and do that again. And as the director mentioned, that's the point in time where we have asked the respondents to an RFP to give us all the information we need to make an informed decision and allow the Board of Land Commissioners to make a board-informed decision. But we don't have that same level of information for all of the citizens of the county who may wish to match that bid. So, Mr. Chairman, that's the only other color I'd add to the director's comments.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just add one other concern that I
Director, go for it, please.
mistakenly left out was, the concern is that if we're spending time with potential revenue generating opportunities and talking with potential applicants for a while, I'm concerned that our ability to draw in additional revenue generating opportunities with third parties might be chilled if people think that they're going to spend all this time with OSLI, and at the end of the day, that opportunity can simply be removed right out from under them. So another concern is our maybe potentially limiting our ability to receive those opportunities and evaluate them if lots of resources are going to be spent on that, and then they're not going to turn into an opportunity for the third party.
Committee, any questions? Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Director, Deputy Director, whichever one of you want to answer this question, and this is kind of general for the new members of the legislature. While we generally refer to a lot of these lands as school sections and school lands and school trust, there are, am I correct, there are 4 other categories of trust lands? And what those might be?
Mr. Crowder.
Mr. Chairman, great question, Representative Burkhart. We manage a lot of different types of land within the office. One of them is trust land. Trust land is what is commonly referred to as the Common School Fund, or the 16s and 36s. But also within the Enabling Act for the state of Wyoming, other lands were granted to it for the benefit of other institutions. 86% of the lands that we manage, and take 2 more steps back, we have 3.9 million subsurface acres that we manage and 3.4 million surface acres that we manage. So 86% of that is for the Common School Fund. The other 14% are for 13 other beneficiaries that have been specifically called out by the Enabling Act for the state of Wyoming. And some examples of those are the Vets Home in Buffalo, the University of Wyoming, the College of Ag, even the buildings here at the Capitol Complex are an identified beneficiary of those lands. Also, the Board of Land Commissioners have been charged with managing also institutional lands. So those lands that are outside of an institution, or the specific definition is not directly utilized for departmental purposes. So those excess lands around a penitentiary or in the Vets Home in Buffalo, those lands around the actual Vets Home in Buffalo are under the charge of the Board of Land Commissioners. Those are a couple examples.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, then a follow-up, please.
Follow-up.
That was the general information for the committee. They may not be aware of that. So Director, Mr. Crowder, I guess I'm looking on page 7 and 8, and we talk about leasing for industrial, commercial, recreational purposes, and we've gone back and included the new section 36.5.118. Could you foresee if someone wanted to, maybe they found a vacant parcel of land in the middle of an oil field, that then you would maybe have a bidding war over gaining access to that parcel or leasing that parcel?
Mr. Crowder.
Mr. Crowder, yeah, well, okay, Director, we'll let you off the hook. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Burkhart, as I read the bill, I think it's specific to surface leases and not oil and gas leases. So you may not have that bidding war in this sense for an oil and gas lease. And keep in mind, we sell all oil and gas leases at an auction anyway, so they have their bidding war, but in a very specific process. As far as having something on the surface that may impact oil and gas development, absolutely. I think that is probably some of the drivers behind the bill, is that let's have a conversation about not only the actual development that could occur on that property, but what else could occur that maybe forgoes the development or enhances some type of conservation important attribute the property may have.
Mr. Chairman,
Director Scoggins.
if I'm understanding the question, Representative Burkhart, on page 2 in that Romanet 2, where it talks about the applicants are given notice of the highest bid to match, I don't read that as requiring a bidding war. What I read that as is whatever we provide notice of is the highest bid, they can come in and match. And so I'm not reading that as moving on with a bidding war from there. But perhaps the intention is something different.
Thank you.
Follow-up?
I'm good. No, I'm good.
Committee members? Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Scoggins and Deputy Director Crowder. I absolutely hear your concerns, and I don't think the intent of the good bringer of the bill is to duplicate notices. But as I know you were both well aware, the concern exists because of the process that was used in Teton County for the 390 parcel. And I'm just wondering if there is some changes we could make in the notice part of what happened, and whether you guys have some thoughts about that or not.
Director Scoggins?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, I think, as I mentioned, when we first came in today, I didn't realize that this was directed to the RFP process. And Deputy Director Crowder can talk a little bit more about what was used in Teton County, but it is my understanding that there's some frustration that perhaps people didn't feel that they had enough notice of the process and what was transpiring there. And I guess my question would be, based on your constituents and the information you're receiving, what you think people feel like they're missing that we could really target, because we're not opposed to providing additional notice. We just want to make sure that it's targeted and a good use of our limited agency resources and staff.
Go ahead.
Follow-up?
I sense Deputy Director Crowder has some additional thoughts.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Crowder.
Representative Storer, I think the process in Teton County was unique and educational at the same time, and appreciated all of the effort and communication that we've received from everybody who is passionate about the lands up there. It's important to note that we had run or planned to run two different processes on the parcel Highway 390, as well as all the other parcels in Teton County. The first process was to reissue or to reuse the lands already under use in specific area on Highway 390, the very southeast corner for those TUPs, to continue the industrial development and to simply try to reach what we couldn't determine would be the market rates for those. So we made the decision, and frankly, we made the decision several years ago, prior to the legislature even taking interest in Teton County, that those parcels needed to be addressed because they likely weren't meeting the bar of creating market rates back to the beneficiaries. Appraisals don't work in that part of the world because, as you know, values and expenses and uses change so rapidly in that county they can't be accurately grabbed in an appraisal. So approaching the true private market of a use is the best way to find those market rates. And so we initiated the TUP process in our normal way, and of course did that after timing was that the legislature passed, I forget the bill, Mr. Chairman, but the study direction to the office to look at all the lands in Teton County to understand if there were other opportunities that we weren't fully noticing or realizing. And it came after the solicitation for permits on those, which were all publicly noticed, all done in the county and spread as far as we could, because the intent was to drive revenue generating streams to the office. So we needed to know more than just what the locals wanted, but the locals plus everybody outside. And obviously through that process, we've heard a lot of comments back that more could be done. And as the director mentioned, we're happy to do more. But want to be clear that the first part of that process was specific to those temporary use permits for that specific 58 acres on Highway 390. And have always expected that any other development of that parcel or any other parcels in Teton County would come with much more public involvement, public communication, and notice. In fact, we've made promises to the legislature as well as the county commissioners in Teton County that before we take any further action beyond these TUPs, that we have town halls related to the specific parcel of either 390 or the Munger Mountain parcel, and listen to the community of what they feel like could be done on that property, and have the same meetings directly with the county commissioners in the planning and zoning department to understand what they feel like could be good uses of that property. And then we would create an RFP process out of that communication moving forward. And hopefully that addresses some of the concerns that you're raising here of increased notice, and that's the whole intent of it.
Representative Storer, follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, both Director Scoggin and Deputy Director Crowder. I do think that in hindsight, those kind of efforts, even though I understand the effort you did make, but clearly there were definitely some missed opportunities for conversations to take place in Teton County on the 390 parcel. I just have one follow-up, which is
Go ahead.
on the, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question of the legislation that speaks to maximizing revenue versus optimizing revenue in the rest of the state, maximizing, excuse me, in Teton County. I'm curious whether you have had asked the Attorney General's office to clarify whether such a distinction is constitutional.
Director Scoggins.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Storer, no, I have not had those specific discussions with the Attorney General's office. We do realize that not in all cases is the maximum revenue for the parcel in the best interest of the trust beneficiary. Sometimes the applicant, there's problems with that we recognize, and so it is possible, and probably has happened where we have awarded leases and things to somebody with a lower bid because we know that there's a problem with an applicant. So, maximizing revenue, while yes, we're trying to generate revenue for K through 12 education. That's always the goal, to facilitate that endeavor. It's not always the main focus.
Thank you. Just one more follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Storer, I
Sorry,
certainly
sorry, hijacked
appreciate
it, but-
the concern around that specific one, but we gotta
Okay.
really try to keep it on this specific.
All right, I'll follow up with
Bill.
you separately. Thank you.
Please do so. Committee, any other
Mr.
questions for?
Chairman, one more question, and just in the interest of time, a yes or no answer is appropriate, and I don't mean to. Do you think we need to add wording to this bill to indicate that it is for the RFP process? You were confused. I think some of us were. Do you think it's necessary to clarify that?
Director Scoggins?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, yes, I think that needs to be clarified in some way. And maybe there's a more succinct way to do it in a couple of paragraphs as opposed to as applicable and referring back to this statute 36.5.118. But yes, I think that there's a way to do that. And it in my opinion, it would be helpful.
Committee, any further questions? Director? Seeing none. Thank you very much, Director. Appreciate your testimony. So we have to gavel back in about 7 minutes. I think probably what we're gonna do is just roll this over until Tuesday. Fortunately, after today, we only have 2 committee meetings left for House bills to be reported out of committee. We might have to figure out a way to meet after adjournment on Tuesday as well, if we want to get through that. And I think that's something perhaps maybe late this afternoon committee, we can circle up and discuss if we're up for that. But the good news for Representative Byron is that he's got extra time to figure out some amendments. I guess, is there any other state agencies? Game and Fish? No? Okay. I suppose we can open up to public comment and start chipping away at anybody who does want to testify. Mr. McGagna?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGagn with the Wyoming Stockgrowers Association, also testifying on behalf of the Wyoming Wool Growers Association. And I've appreciated the opportunity. I've worked some with the sponsor of this bill. The language on page 2, lines 4 through 11, we believe lays out a very good and thorough process for notice. And particularly applicable to industrial, commercial, recreational leasing, because those are cases where in most instances, you're talking about instituting an activity or authorizing an activity on a parcel of state land that hasn't existed there before. So I think the need for that public input is greater there. And the Teton County parcel that's been discussed was a good example where had this been in place, I think we wouldn't have some of the challenges we do today. But I do have problems with applying it to grazing and agricultural leasing, because in that case, even on vacant lands, and it could be applied to vacant lands, but even in that case, you're not talking about a new activity. You're talking about a continuation of an activity that's gone on that land for decades in most cases. Perhaps it'll be conducted by a new successful applicant, but the activity isn't a new activity. And so for that reason, I believe this is not needed and causes confusion there. It also causes confusion with grazing lands because it talks about a preference to local interests, and there's already an existing preference for an adjacent landowner. So when you have, and we've run into this before, when you have more than one preference conflicting with each other, it really creates confusion. And I think that the process for grazing lands and agricultural lands, with some significant changes in how it's handled on vacant lands that have been made by the legislature last year, that are contained in some other bills that have moved through the House this session, takes care of that. So the need that I would see for the language in terms of notice, to me, is specific to those other types of leases that are not the traditional leases and uses of the state land. With that, in the interest of time, I would be happy to answer any questions, but would recommend that if the bill moves forward, that the references to 365103, 365105 be removed entirely, and the others as well. By having every section of this statute refer back to that section, I think as I try to work through it, it creates some real confusion between what is required in existing law and what you're imposing in addition there with regard to grazing and agricultural leasing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Magagna. Committee, we got maybe time for one question? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. I think we're just going to roll this over to Tuesday. Again, Mr. Byron, you've got some extra time to come up with amendments to save your bill. So with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, before we adjourn, are you going to leave public comment open or are you going to close it?
Just real quick, is there any other public comment in the room for this bill? I don't think Barb, is there any online? All right, let's go ahead and just close public comment and we'll just resume consideration on Tuesday. So thank you very much. We are adjourned.